Wrestling and mixed martial arts are like salt and pepper or garlic and onions. They're absolutely perfect for one another. And I'm not talking about professional wrestling, although the modern day UFC does have its similarities to it. No, I'm talking about amateur wrestling. There have been countless wrestling champions and All-Americans who seamlessly made the transition from wrestling to mixed martial arts, and not for nothing. Names like Johny Hendricks and Brock Lesnar prove that wrestlers are some of the toughest people in the world and that they're able to easily transfer their skills from the mat to the cage. In fact, a lot of MMA pundits argue that wrestling is actually a better discipline to start learning than Jiu-Jitsu if you want to become a mixed martial artist someday. And with that being said, we're going to be looking at the top 5 best wrestlers in the UFC today. This is MMA Edge. I hope you're ready for this one. Number 5, Dan Severn. While Dan Severn may not be the best wrestler in the UFC today, there's no arguing that he's contributed a lot to the sport of MMA. What's more, Severn is arguably the very reason why many wrestlers are considering careers in MMA, as he was the very first amateur wrestler to ever compete inside the octagon. Dan Severn walked into UFC 4 as one of the favorites to win against Royce Gracie, coming in with 13 AAU wrestling championships and several other Olympic medals to his name. And although Severn failed to dethrone the then undefeated champion in Gracie, he managed to win the next tournament in UFC 5, becoming the first ever wrestler to win a UFC tournament. His countless achievements in the sport of amateur wrestling, coupled with his massive success in the world of mixed martial arts, lands him the number 5 spot on our list of best wrestlers in the UFC. Number 4, Henry Cejudo. Henry Cejudo is living proof that wrestling applies well in the context of a mixed martial arts fight. Cejudo won several elite level wrestling competitions back when he was just a teenager, right before he went on to win a gold medal in the 2008 Summer Olympics, becoming one of the youngest competitors to ever win in the Olympics at the time. Cejudo's skills as a wrestler, coupled with his experience inside the cage, created the most well-rounded fighter you could ever ask for. In fact, Cejudo's only losses were to Demetrius Johnson and Joseph Benavidez. Mighty Mouse was often regarded as the greatest flyweight fighter of all time, and Cejudo eventually avenged his loss to him before DJ ultimately moved on to compete at one championship. His other loss against Joseph Benavidez was controversial, as his repeated low blows eventually led to the judges handing Benavidez the win after the fight. Cejudo quickly righted his ship though by getting huge wins over names such as Sergio Pettis, Wilson Reese, and most recently the bantamweight king himself, TJ Dillashaw. The Messenger is without a doubt one of the greatest fighters in MMA, and he has a lot to thank his wrestling training for it. Number 3, Ben Askren. Ben Askren is one of the most skilled and decorated wrestlers to have ever stepped into a mixed martial arts cage. He also happens to be a 2-time state champion in Wisconsin and a 2-time NCAA champion in the University of Missouri. His achievements in the field of amateur wrestling, coupled with his accomplishments in MMA promotions outside of the UFC, such as Bellator and one championship, shows just why fans are so excited to finally see him in action inside the octagon. In fact, Askren was so dominant in the sport of MMA that he's never lost a single time throughout his lengthy career. His recent win over MMA legend and former welterweight champion Robbie Lawler simply shows that Askren isn't just another one of your average hype trains, and that he's here to make a statement in the UFC. Whether or not he'll ever become the champion inside the promotion remains unknown, but there's absolutely no doubt that he's not only one of the best fighters to have ever stepped inside, he's also one of the best wrestlers in the UFC today. Number 2, Khabib Nurmagomedov. This list would surely be incomplete without Khabib Nurmagomedov's name on it. There are a few fighters in the history of the UFC who are as good as Nurmagomedov when it comes to wrestling. And while the Eagle technically doesn't practice freestyle wrestling like the other fighters on our list, he's particularly one of the best in the sport of combat sambo, a martial art in Russia that's extremely similar to wrestling. Sambo also happens to borrow a few techniques from Judo and Jiu-Jitsu, but it's the closest thing you can get to wrestling in Russia. There would also be no doubt in anyone's mind that Khabib will excel in a freestyle wrestling match, as he's already displayed his wrestling skills against fighters who happen to be good wrestlers. His particular fight with Al Iaquinta showed just how good a wrestler Khabib really is, as Iaquinta had a perfect amateur wrestling record when he was in high school, and everyone recognized him as a wrestling prodigy when he was young. The fact that he dominated Iaquinta in his own game so effortlessly proved that Khabib is truly one of the best wrestlers the UFC has now. Number 1. Daniel Cormier. DC is as good as anyone can get in the sport of wrestling. His particular wins over the likes of Frank Mir, Roy Nelson, Dan Henderson, and Alexander Gustafsson, to name a few, all show just how great a wrestler Daniel Cormier really is. In fact, his convincing win over up-and-coming knockout artist Derek Lewis showed Cormier's prowess in wrestling, completely overpowering the Black Beast with his signature wrestling style pressure, while not giving his opponent a moment's pause. Lewis was unable to mount any kind of offense, as Cormier simply didn't give him the distance to strike back. Cormier's only significant losses in his career were to Jon Jones, and everyone knows that Jon Jones is one of the greatest fighters in the history of mixed martial arts. On top of that, Jones also took steroids prior to his fights with DC, adding more doubt to his victories over the iconic wrestler. Whether or not Cormier and Jones are willing to go through a third trilogy fight, there's no doubt in anyone's mind that Cormier has done more than enough to prove that he's the greatest wrestler in the UFC today, which is exactly why he swiped the number 1 spot on our list today. And that's going to be it for our video today. Smash that like button, subscribe and comment down below if you haven't already for more epic MMA content.